Chapter 15 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 15. Lincoln and the Churches. In a conflict which was founded upon the quickened moral sense of the people, it was not strange that the government received the most earnest support from the churches. From one end of the loyal states to the other, all the religious organizations, with few exceptions, moved by the twin forces of patriotism and religion, ranged themselves upon the side of the government against the rebellion. A large number of pulpits in the North had already taken their place as tribunes for defense of popular freedom, and it was from them that, at the menace of war, the first cries of danger and of defiance rang out. Those ministers who had for years been denouncing the encroachments of slavery did not wait for any organized action on the part of their colleagues, but proclaimed at once, in 1,000 varying tones, that peace was a blessing worth fighting for. The more conservative churches were but little in rear of the more advanced. Those who had counseled moderation and patience with the South, on account of the divided responsibility for slavery which rested on both halves of the nation, speedily felt the sense of release from the obligations of brotherhood when the South had repudiated and renounced them, and rallied to the support of the insulted flag with an earnestness not less ardent and more steadily trustworthy than that of the original anti-slavery clergy. As the war went on, and as every stage of it gave a clearer presage of the coming destruction of slavery, the deliverances of the churches became every day more and more decided in favor of the national cause and the downfall of human bondage. To detail the 1,000 ways in which the churches testified their support of the national cause, to give even an abstract of the countless expressions of loyalty which came from the different religious bodies of the country, would occupy many volumes. We can only refer briefly to a few of the more important utterances of some of the great religious societies. In all the church conventions which met after the President's preliminary proclamation of the 22nd of September, 1862, that act of liberation was greeted with the heartiest expressions of approval and support. The Baptist Convention of New York declared that, while we see with the profoundest sorrow thousands of husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons falling on the battlefield, considering the interest to be preserved and transmitted to future generations, we cannot regard the sacrifice of treasure and of life too much for the object to be secured. They denounced human slavery as the procuring cause of the rebellion now raging among us. They declared that the spirit of the age, the safety of the country, and the laws of God require its entire removal. The American Baptist Missionary Union had, in the spring of 1862, adopted with unanimity resolutions characterizing the war now waged by the national government to put down the unprovoked and wicked rebellion that had arisen against us, and to establish anew the reign of order and of law as a most righteous and holy one, sanctioned alike by God and all right-thinking men, expressing their opinion that the principal cause and origin of this attempt to destroy the government has been the institution of slavery, and that a safe, solid, and lasting peace could not be expected short of its complete overthrow. The next year they declared that the developments of the past year had only tended to deepen their conviction of these truths, which they solemnly reiterated and affirmed. They referred to the fatal and suicidal blows inflicted upon slavery by the slaveholders' rebellion, and said that, for thus overruling what appeared at first to be a terrible national calamity, to the production of results so unexpected and glorious, their gratitude and adoration are due to that wonder-working God, who still maketh the wrath of men to praise him, while the remainder of wrath he restrains. They approved the President's proclamation and the acts of Congress abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia and the Territories, and hailed the dawn of that glorious day when liberty shall be proclaimed throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. In severe and dignified language they expressed their gratitude for whatever measure of sympathy they had received from abroad, but at the same time declared that the United States asked no assistance from other nations, and would brook no intervention or interference. In October 1861, at a meeting of the American Board of Foreign Missions in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Venerable Albert Barnes was granted leave to introduce, without reference to a committee, a series of resolutions expressing the hearty sympathy of the board in the efforts to suppress the rebellion, hoping for the deliverance of the world from the oppression of slavery, and gratefully acknowledging the divine interposition in the success which has attended the arms of the nation as an indication that we shall again be one people, united under one glorious Constitution, united in our efforts to spread the gospel around the world. These resolutions were adopted unanimously with great enthusiasm, the audience rising to their feet and singing the national anthem. The state conferences of the Congregational churches passed similar resolutions from time to time. As a specimen of all, we give an abstract of the resolutions of the Conference of Massachusetts in 1864. The chief hope of rebellion is in the sympathy and distraction of a divided North, and the surest and shortest way to peace is not to recall our armies and to relax our grasp upon the enemy, but to present a united and loyal front and an unconquerable determination to prosecute the war till the power of the government meets no longer armed resistance. They disclaim any feeling of despondency or of impatience, believing that God is on our side, and interpret hopefully the divine delays which have led to more and more radical and precious resolutions and deliverances, and assert roundly that with undaunted courage that there can be no effectual reestablishment of the national authority by any negotiation which confesses the inability of the government to subdue rebellion by force of arms, and proposes terms of peace to rebels still flying the flag of defiance. It was not only in New England that the Congregational churches maintained this stern and patriotic attitude. The General Association of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania came boldly forward in the autumn of 1864, and, discarding all pretenses of nonpartisanship or neutrality, declared for the reelection of Mr. Lincoln in these unqualified words: "As the momentous issues of this long and deadly contest are approaching their solution in a combined struggle in the field and at the polls, we will sustain with our votes the brave and noble men who are defending our liberties with their lives, and will animate our fellow citizens by every consideration of religious hope and duty, of devotion to country and to liberty, to make the decision of the people on the 8th of November final and fatal to the hopes of traitors in arms and conspirators in political councils. Our hopes for the preservation of our liberties as a nation and for the complete emancipation of the African race in the South depend under God upon sustaining the government in upholding the integrity of the Union throughout all the trials and doubts of the war, and in that policy which looks to the abandonment of slavery as the condition of permanent union and peace." The German Reformed Synod passed earnest resolutions urging upon their clergy and laity to continue to labor and pray for the success of the government in its efforts to suppress the rebellion and to restore peace and union. These resolutions were reiterated from year to year in every state where this church had an organization in existence. The Lutheran General Synod, which met at York in 1864, passed resolutions denouncing slavery, setting forth the necessity of its forcible suppression, the righteousness of the war which is waged by the government of the United States for the maintenance of the national life, and the duty of every Christian to support it by the whole weight of his influence, his prayers, and his efforts. The Moravian Synod also denounced slavery and considered an earnest support of the Constitution and the laws a religious duty, and expressed its willingness to render all the aid in its power to subdue unrighteous rebellion and extend the rightful authority of the government over every portion of our country. One of the most weighty utterances of any religious organization during the war was that of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of the United States, which met at Columbus, Ohio, in the spring of 1862. Important as was this deliverance from the sanction which it carried as the utterance of one of the most considerable religious organizations in the country, it was no less significant as the work of the Reverend Dr. R.J. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who held a position second to none in the border states in character, in political influence, and in social connections. This remarkable paper began with the praise of peace, but, in striking contrast to the many craven pleas based upon this theme during the war, it threw the blame of the violation of peace upon the disloyal and traitorous attempt to overthrow the national government by military force. The report continues: "This whole treason, rebellion, anarchy, fraud, and violence is utterly contrary to the dictates of natural religion and morality, and is plainly condemned by the revealed will of God. It is the clear and solemn duty of the national government to preserve, at whatever cost, the national Union and Constitution, to maintain the laws in their supremacy, to crush force by force, and to restore the reign of public order and peace to the entire nation by whatever lawful means that are necessary thereunto. And it is the bounden duty of the people who compose this great nation, each one in his several place and degree, to uphold the federal government and every state government, and all persons in authority, whether civil or military, in all their lawful and proper acts, unto the end hereinbefore set forth. The report denounces treason, rebellion, and anarchy as sinful, and gravely deprecates the conduct of the Southern synods in encouraging them. The concluding section says, "We record our gratitude to God for the prevailing unity of sentiment and general internal peace which have characterized the Church in the states that have not revolted, embracing a great majority of ministers, congregations, and people under our care. It may still be called with emphasis a loyal, orthodox, and pious Church, and all its acts and works indicate its right to a title so noble. Let a spirit of quietness, of mutual forbearance, and of ready obedience to authority, both civil and ecclesiastical, illustrate the loyalty, the orthodoxy, and the piety of the Church. In the name and by the authority of the Lord Jesus, we earnestly exhort all who love God or fear his wrath to turn a deaf ear to all counsels and suggestions that tend towards a reaction favorable to disloyalty, schism, or disturbance, either in the Church or in the country. In all these respects we must give account to God in that great day, and it is in view of our own dread responsibility to the Judge of quick and dead that we now make this deliverance." This austere and unqualified declaration of loyalty, this denunciation of treason, which was at that hour lifting a defiant and almost triumphant head through a great part of the Union, was adopted by a majority which, under the circumstances, is surprising. 206 ministers and ruling elders voted for it. Only 20 voted against it. Less than 1 in 10 failed to rise to that height of moral and political duty. The keynote thus early set governed this powerful Church throughout the war. Its General Assembly meeting at Newark, New Jersey, in 1864, adopted a long and most energetic report, declaring that the time has at length come in the providence of God when it is His will that every vestige of human slavery among us should be effaced, and that every Christian man should address himself with industry and earnestness to his appropriate part in the performance of this great duty. Under the influence of the most incomprehensible infatuation of wickedness, those who are most deeply interested in the perpetuation of slavery have taken away every motive for its further toleration. An attempt was made at the meeting of the Synod of New York to censure this action of the General Assembly of the Church, but it was voted down by a majority of 6 to 1. The General Assembly of the United Presbyterian Church had passed equally strong and uncompromising resolutions. Believing it to be a duty especially incumbent on the Church to let her light shine, we trust that all the preachers of the gospel, of every denomination, will hear and obey God's voice, now calling upon them louder than ever before to open their mouth on behalf of the dumb. The Reformed Presbyterian Church, commonly called the Scotch Covenanters, addressed the President by committee in 1862, beginning with the proud boast that this Church, true to its high lineage and ancient spirit, does not hold within its pale a single secessionist or sympathizer with rebellion in these United States. They congratulated him upon the anti-slavery measures of the government and urged him, by every consideration drawn from the Word of God and the present condition of our bleeding country, not to be moved from the path of duty on which you have so auspiciously entered, either by the threats or blandishments of the enemies of human progress, or through fears of timid friends. 2 years later they met and declared that it is the duty of the Church of Christ to encourage and sustain the government of this country in all that they do for the honor of God, the freedom of the enslaved, the mitigation of the inevitable evils of war, and the preservation, at all hazards, of the national life, integrity, and power. The New School Presbyterians also lifted their voice with equal energy and clearness against the rebellion and in favor of the government. At their General Assembly each year during the war they adopted resolutions of the most uncompromising loyalty, and on several occasions addressed the President personally with messages full of ardent devotion and high encouragement. They said, "Since the day of your inauguration, the thousands of our membership have followed you with unceasing prayer, besieging the throne of heaven in your behalf. When we look at the history of your administration hitherto, and at the wonderful way in which this people have been led under your guidance, we glorify God in you." A year later they embodied their sentiments of loyalty to the Union and opposition to slavery in a forcible series of resolutions, which were brought to Washington and presented to the President by a committee of which John A. Foote, a brother of the Admiral, was chairman. The President replied, "It has been my happiness to receive testimonies of a similar nature from, I believe, all denominations of Christians. This to me is most gratifying, because from the beginning I saw that the issues of our great struggle depended on the divine interposition and favor. As a pilot, I have used my best exertions to keep afloat our ship of state, and shall be glad to resign my trust at the appointed time to another pilot more skillful and successful than I may prove. In every case, and at all hazards, the government must be perpetuated. Relying as I do upon the Almighty power, and encouraged as I am by these resolutions which you have just read, with the support which I receive from Christian men, I shall not hesitate to use all the means at my control to secure the termination of this rebellion, and will hope for success." Of the firm and loyal attitude of the Protestant Episcopal Church, this resolution of the Convention of the Diocese of Pennsylvania may serve as an example. "We hereby declare our unfaltering allegiance to the government of the United States, and we pledge it our willing devotion and service. And as a body of Christians we will ever pray that, in God's own time and way, this rebellion may be put down, that oppression and slavery in all its forms may be done away, that freedom of body and mind, political and religious, may everywhere prevail. That the emancipated Negroes, whom God in His providence is committing to our care, may be the objects of our liberal and Christian regard and instruction. That war may soon cease throughout all our borders, and that our now lacerated country may again be so united that from the lakes of the north to the Gulf on the south, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, there shall be but one union, one government, one flag, one constitution, the whole culminating in that higher glory which shall make this nation Emmanuel's land, a mountain of holiness and a dwelling place of righteousness." No church was more ready or powerful in its support of the government than the widespread Methodist Episcopal Church. From the beginning it took ground firmly and unanimously for the national cause. The Western armies especially were filled with the young and vigorous fighting men of that connection. To a committee of the General Conference of 1864 the President said, "Nobly sustained as the government has been by all the churches, I would utter nothing which might in the least appear invidious against any. Yet, without this, it may fairly be said that the Methodist Episcopal Church, not less devoted than the best, is, by its greater numbers, the most important of all. It is no fault in others that the Methodist Church sends more soldiers to the field, more nurses to the hospitals, and more prayers to heaven than any other. God bless the Methodist Church. Bless all the churches, and blessed be God, who in this our great trial giveth us the churches." These energetic expressions of loyalty were not confined to the Protestant churches alone. Archbishop Hughes in New York gave his great personal and ecclesiastical influence to the support of the government, and Archbishop Purcell of Cincinnati took occasion, in recommending the observance of Thanksgiving Day, 1864, to his people to urge upon them the cause of the country. He said, "We confess that it has greatly pained us to hear that certain rash, irreverent, and thoughtless men of our communion have denounced and abused the government, the administration, and their abettors. Now God commands us to bless and curse not. And when bad men cursed the supporters of the government, did they not reflect that they cursed the more than hundreds of thousands of Catholic voters and Catholic soldiers of our army who defend the government in the field? Did they not reflect that its downfall would be hailed with acclamation by our own hereditary oppressors across the ocean? Did they reflect that if political salvation is ever to reach a far distant and beloved island, it must come to it from these United States which they would sever?" The administration did not commence this war, the Archbishop said, and went on in his address to contrast the conduct of the national government with that of the rebellion. He said in conclusion, "It is time that all should rally around the powers which the Apostle commands us to obey, and thus, presenting an undivided front to the enemy, re-establish the Union, without which there can be no panacea, absent or prospective, for the ills we suffer." The Society of Friends occupied a peculiar relation to the war. By the two leading tenets of their religion they were drawn in different ways. They were intensely opposed both to slavery and to war. While, therefore, they were ready to favor every act of Mr. Lincoln's administration which promised to abridge the power and shorten the duration of slavery, they were placed in a cruel dilemma when called upon to take part in the only measures by which the country could be preserved, and the predominance of a government based upon slavery prevented. The result was as might readily be imagined. Human nature asserted itself in the midst of that serious and tranquil communion as everywhere else, and the friends acted each according to his individual bent. In the words of the address of the yearly meeting of 1864, "Many of our young men, overcome by the spirit of war, have rushed into the conflict where some of them found an early death. Some have purchased their release from the draft by the payment of money. Others have remained steadfast in their faith in the hour of trial, thereby subjecting themselves to the penalty for desertion." Those who entered the army illustrated in their plain speech and quiet courage the virtues of their lineage no less than those who, refusing to bear arms, bore uncomplainingly all that the law could inflict upon them by way of punishment for their contumacy. But the Society, as a body, remained outwardly true to both articles of its creed, and protested constantly against both slavery and the war which it caused. The yearly meeting of 1862 greeted with hearty approval the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, while praying that the effusion of blood might be stayed, and that of 1864, while appreciating the difficulties that surrounded those upon whom rests the responsibility of guiding the nation through the awful perils of civil war, and declining to enter into judgment with those who differ from them, still persisted in their dignified petition to the President and to the Congress that they might not be compelled to offend their own consciences by complying with the law requiring military service. Mr. Lincoln's attitude in relation to this question was especially delicate. Himself of Quaker ancestry, he felt a peculiar sympathy with their scruples, and yet he could not legally relieve them from their liabilities, and he clearly perceived the impolicy of recommending to Congress any specific measures of relief. He heard and answered their addresses with the greatest patience and respect, and intervened with his prerogative on occasions of peculiar hardship. We owe to these complications 2 or 3 letters which strikingly exhibit his quick sympathies, his keen sense of justice, and his profound religious feeling. To the Quakers of Iowa, who had sent him an address through Senator Harlan, he wrote: "It is most cheering and encouraging for me to know that in the efforts which I have made and am making for the restoration of a righteous peace to the country, I am upheld and sustained by the good wishes and prayers of God's people. No one is more deeply than myself aware that without His favor our highest wisdom is but as foolishness, and that our most strenuous efforts would avail nothing in the shadow of His displeasure. It seems to me that if there be one subject upon which all good men may unitedly agree, it is in imploring the gracious favor of the God of nations upon the struggle our people are making for the preservation of their precious birthright of civil and religious liberty." To the Quakers of Rhode Island, in answer to a letter, he said: "Engaged as I am in a great war, I fear it will be difficult for the world to understand how fully I appreciate the principles of peace inculcated in this letter and everywhere by the Society of Friends." But one of the most significant of the President's letters, in which he expresses with less than his usual reserve his idea of the moral and religious bearings of the great conflict, was written to Mrs. Gurney, the wife of the eminent English preacher of the Society of Friends, in the autumn of 1864. It shows in a singularly touching and instructive way how the ancestral faith of the Quaker survived in the son of a pioneer, commander-in-chief of 1,000,000 of men engaged in the most destructive wars of modern times. My esteemed friend, I have not forgotten, probably never shall forget, the very impressive occasion when yourself and friends visited me on a Sabbath forenoon 2 years ago, nor has your kind letter, written nearly a year later, ever been forgotten. In all, it has been your purpose to strengthen my reliance on God. I am much indebted to the good Christian people of the country for their constant prayers and consolations, and to no one of them more than to yourself. The purposes of the Almighty are perfect, and must prevail, though we erring mortals may fail to accurately perceive them in advance. We hoped for a happy termination of this terrible long war before this, but God knows best, and has ruled otherwise. We shall yet acknowledge His wisdom and our own error therein. Meanwhile we must work earnestly in the best lights He gives us, trusting that so working still conduces to the great ends He ordains. Surely He intends some great good to follow this mighty convulsion, which no mortal could make, and no mortal could stay. Your people, the Friends, have had, and are having, a very great trial. On principle and faith, opposed to both war and oppression, they can only practically oppose oppression by war. In this hard dilemma some have chosen one horn, some the other. For those appealing to me on conscientious grounds, I have done and shall do the best I could and can in my own conscience, under my oath to the law. That you believe this I doubt not, and believing it I shall still receive for our country and myself your earnest prayers to our Father in heaven. Your sincere friend, A. Lincoln. Among the most important agencies through which the mingled patriotism and religion of the country lent their assistance to the armies of the Union were the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission. The former collected and disbursed not less than $5 million in cash and $9 million in supplies for the benefit of the armies in the field and the sick and wounded in the hospitals, while the Christian Commission raised some $4,500,000, not only for this purpose, but also to extend to the soldiers the benefits and consolations of religion in cases where the overworked army chaplains found the complete fulfillment of these offices beyond their powers. The sanitary fairs throughout the country were remarkable exhibitions of the patriotism and philanthropy of the people. They were carried on to a great extent by the women of the country, and the quickening of the national spirit by these concerted efforts was of more importance to the Union cause than even the vast sum of money which were produced, though these were unprecedented in the annals of charity. The Fair of New York realized $1,300,000, nearly all of which was clear profit. On every great battlefield of the war, even before the thunder of the artillery was silenced, the trains of these great organizations were upon the field, and their members were engaged in caring for the wounded, bearing away the sick, praying with the dying, and receiving their last messages, while in every village of the North gentle and patriotic women were constantly employed making ready the stores of luxuries and delicacies dispensed by charitable agents at the front. In the work of these beneficent agencies the President took a profound interest. He frequently consulted with Dr. H. W. Bellows and George H. Stewart as to the best means of carrying on their work. Being requested to preside at a meeting of the Christian Commission held in Washington on the 22nd of February, 1863, he wrote, "While for reasons that I deem sufficient I must decline to preside, I cannot withhold my approval of the meeting and its worthy objects. Whatever shall be, sincerely and in God's name, devised for the good of the soldiers and seamen in their hard spheres of duty, can scarcely fail to be blessed. And whatever shall tend to turn our thoughts from the unreasoning and uncharitable passions, prejudices, and jealousies incident to a great national trouble such as ours, and to fix them on the vast and long-enduring consequences, for weal or for woe, which are to result from the struggle, especially to strengthen our reliance on the Supreme Being for the final triumph of the right, cannot but be well for us all. The birthday of Washington and the Christian Sabbath coinciding this year, suggesting together the highest interests in this life and of that to come, is the most propitious for the meeting proposed." The cause of the rebellion was adopted and carried on by the churches in the South, if not with more zeal and determination, at least with greater vehemence at the beginning than was shown by the religious organizations of the North. Even before the war began, the State Convention of Baptists in Alabama made haste to rush into secession, saying that the Union had failed in important particulars to answer the purpose for which it was created, and that they held themselves subject to the call of proper authority in defense of the sovereignty of Alabama and of her right as a sovereignty to withdraw from this Union. Several of the Presbyterian synods of the South went headlong into the rebellion before the close of the year 1860, and others followed their example in the autumn meetings of 1861. They formed the General Assembly of the South on the 4th of December of that year. Even before the inauguration of Mr. Lincoln, the Protestant Episcopal Convention of several states formally withdrew from the Union, and that fiery soldier priest, Leonidas Polk, Bishop of Louisiana, commended the clergy to shift their public prayers from the President of the United States to that of the Confederate States, saying, "Our separation from our brethren of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States has been effected because we must follow our nationality. Our relations to each other hereafter will be the relations we both now hold to the men of our mother church in England." Unable to restrain his ardor within the limits of the church militant, he exchanged his crozier for a sword, and in 1864 died by a cannon shot on the Georgia hills. At the session of the First General Council of the Protestant Episcopal Church at Augusta, an address was adopted congratulating the Church in the Confederate States upon the unity which existed in its councils, upon its promise of growth and expansion, and upon the fact that the leading minds of the new republic were of their own communion. They called upon the Church to make strenuous efforts in behalf of the slaves of the South, and gently advocated such an arrangement of their peculiar institution as not to violate the right of marriage among the blacks. Hitherto, they say, we have been hindered by the pressure of abolitionists. Now that we have thrown off from us that hateful and infidel pestilence, we should prove to the world that we are faithful to our trust, and that the Church should lead the hosts of the Lord in this work of justice and mercy. Feeble efforts in this direction were made by churches and other communions in the South, but strong opposition was at once developed. In the Transylvania Presbytery, it was argued that, though the matter presented was one of undoubted grievance, involving a sin which ought to be purged away, yet, to prevent agitation in the Church at such a time of intense political strife, there must be no intermeddling, and a resolution in favor of the solemnization of matrimony among slaves was laid upon the table, nearly every member of the Presbytery voting against it. The Methodist Church in the South had separated from their brethren in the North 15 years before the war on the question of slavery, and a portion of their clergy and laity, when the war broke out, naturally engaged in it with their accustomed zeal. But they were by no means unanimous, even within the seceding states, and the organization was sorely afflicted and impoverished by the war, though at its close they resumed their work with undiminished energy and soon regained all they had lost. As the national authority began to be reestablished throughout the states in rebellion, not the least embarrassing of the questions which generals in command were called upon to decide was that of the treatment of churches whose pastors were openly or covertly disloyal to the Union. There was no general plan adopted by the government for such cases. In fact, it was impossible to formulate a policy which should meet so vast a variety of circumstances as presented themselves in the different regions of the South. The Board of Missions of the Methodist Church sent down some of their ablest ministers, with general authority to take charge of the abandoned churches, and to establish in them their interrupted worship. The mission boards of other denominations took similar action, and the Secretary of War gave general orders to the officers commanding the different departments to permit ministers of the gospel bearing the commission of these mission boards to exercise the functions of their office, and to give them all the aid, countenance, and support which might be practicable. But before and after these orders there was much clashing between the military and the ecclesiastical authorities, which had its rise, generally, in the individual temperaments of the respective generals and priests. There was an instance in one place where a young officer rose in his pew and requested an Episcopal minister to read the prayer for the President of the United States, which he had omitted. Upon the minister's refusal, the soldier advanced to the pulpit and led the preacher, loudly protesting, to the door, and then quietly returning to the altar himself, read the prayer, not much, it is to be feared, to the edification of the congregation. General Butler arrested a clergyman in Norfolk, and placed him at hard labor on the public works for disloyalty in belief and action, but the President reversed this sentence and changed it to one of exclusion from the Union lines. The Catholic Bishop of Natchez, having refused to read the prescribed form of prayer for the President, and having protested in an able and temperate paper against the orders of the commanding general in this regard, the latter ordered him to be expelled from the Union lines, although the order was almost immediately rescinded. General Rosecrans issued an order in Missouri requiring the members of religious convocations to give satisfactory evidence of their loyalty to the government of the United States, as a condition precedent to their assemblage and protection. In answer to the protestations which naturally resulted from this mandate, he replied that it was given at the request of many loyal church members, both lay and clerical, that if he should permit all bodies claiming to be religious to meet without question, a convocation of Price's army, under the garb of religion, might assemble with impunity and plot treason. He claimed that there was no hardship in compelling the members of such assemblages to establish their loyalty by oath and certificate, and insisted that his order, while protesting against public danger, really protected the purity and freedom of religion. In the course of these controversies between secessionist ministers and commanding generals, an incident occurred which deserves a moment's notice, as it led to a clear and vigorous statement from Mr. Lincoln of his attitude in regard to these matters. During the year 1862, a somewhat bitter discussion arose between the Rev. Dr. McFeeters, of the Vine Street Church in St. Louis, and some of his congregation, in regard to his supposed sympathies with the rebellion. Looking back upon the controversy from this distance of time, it seems that rather hard measure was dealt to the parson, for although, from all the circumstances of the case, there appears little doubt that his feelings were strongly enlisted in the cause of the rebellion, He behaved with so much discretion that the principal offenses charged against him by his zealous parishioners were that he once baptized a baby rebel by the name of Sterling Price, and that he would not declare himself in favor of the Union. The difference in his church grew continually more flagrant, and was sustained by interminable letters and statements on both sides, until at last the provost marshal intervened, ordering the arrest of Dr. McFeeters, excluding him from his pulpit, and taking control of his church out of the hands of its trustees. This action gave rise to extended comment, not only in Missouri, but throughout the Union. The President, being informed of it, wrote to General Curtis, disapproving the act of the provost marshal, saying, in a terse and vigorous phrase, which immediately obtained wide currency, "The United States government must not, as by this order, undertake to run the churches. When an individual in a church, or out of it, becomes dangerous to the public interest, he must be checked, but let the churches as such take care of themselves." But even this peremptory and unmistakable command did not put an end to the discussion. Taking the hands of the government away from the preacher did not quench the dissensions in the church, nor restore the pastor to the position which he occupied before the war, and almost a year later some of the friends of Dr. McFeeters considered it necessary and proper to ask the intervention of the President to restore to him all his ecclesiastical privileges, in addition to the civil rights which they admitted he already enjoyed. This the President, in a letter of equal clearness and vigor, refused to do. "I have never interfered," he said, "nor thought of interfering, as to who shall or shall not preach in any church, nor have I knowingly or believingly tolerated anyone else to so interfere by my authority." But he continues, "If, after all, what is now sought is to have me put Dr. McFeeters back over the heads of a majority of his own congregation, that too will be declined. I will not have control of any church on any side." The case finally ended by the exclusion of Dr. McFeeters from his pulpit by the order of the presbytery having ecclesiastical authority in the case. In this wise and salutary abstention from any interference with the churches, which was dictated by his own convictions as well as enjoined by the Constitution, the President did not always have the support of his subordinates. He had not only, as we have seen, to administer occasional rebukes to his overzealous generals, but even in his own cabinet he was sometimes compelled to overrule a disposition to abuse of authority in things spiritual. Several weeks after he had so clearly expressed himself in the McFeeters case, he found, to his amazement, that the Secretary of War had been giving orders virtually putting the army in certain places at the disposition of a Methodist bishop for the enforcement of his ecclesiastical decrees. He addressed to Mr. Stanton a note of measured censure, which was followed by an order from the War Department explaining and modifying the more objectionable features of the former document. The Secretary explained that his action had no other intention than to furnish a means of rallying the Methodist people in favor of the Union in localities where the rebellion had disorganized and scattered them. This explanation was not entirely satisfactory to the President, but he thought best to make no further public reference to the matter. Scarcely was this affair disposed of when a complaint was received from Memphis of some interference by the military with a church edifice there. Mr. Lincoln made upon the paper this peremptory endorsement: "If the military have military need of the church building, let them keep it. Otherwise let them get out of it, and leave it and its owners alone, except for causes that justify the arrest of anyone." 2 months later the President, hearing of further complications in the case, made still another order, which, even at the risk of wearying the reader, we will give, from his own manuscript, as illustrating not only his conscientious desire that justice should be done, but also the exasperating obstacles he was continually compelled to surmount in those troubled times to accomplish, with all the vast powers at his disposition, this reasonable desire. "I am now told that the military were not in possession of the building, and yet that in pretended execution of the above, they, the military, put one set of men out of and another set into the building. This, if true, is most extraordinary. I say again, if there be no military need for the building, leave it alone, neither putting any one in nor out of it except on finding some one preaching or practicing treason, in which case lay hands upon him just as if he were doing the same thing in any other building, or in the streets or highways." He at last made himself understood and his orders respected. Yet so widespread was the tendency of generals to meddle with matters beyond their jurisdiction that it took 3 years of such vehement injunctions as these to teach them to keep their hands away from the clergy and the churches. Lincoln had a profound respect for every form of sincere religious belief. He steadily refused to show favor to any particular denomination of Christians, and when General Grant issued an unjust and injurious order against the Jews, expelling them from his department, the President ordered it to be revoked the moment it was brought to his notice. Lincoln was a man of profound and intense religious feeling. We have no purpose of attempting to formulate his creed. We question if he himself ever did so. There have been swift witnesses who, judging from expressions uttered in his callow youth, have called him an atheist, and others who, with the most laudable intentions, have remembered improbable conversations which they bring forward to prove at once his orthodoxy and their own intimacy with him. But leaving aside these apocryphal evidences, we have only to look at his authentic public and private utterances to see how deep and strong in all the latter part of his life was the current of his religious thought and emotion. He continually invited and appreciated, at their highest value, the prayers of good people. The pressure of the tremendous problems by which he was surrounded, the awful moral significance of the conflict in which he was the chief combatant, the overwhelming sense of personal responsibility which never left him for an hour, all contributed to produce, in a temperament naturally serious and predisposed to a spiritual view of life and conduct, a sense of reverent acceptance of the guidance of a superior power. From that morning when, standing amid the falling snowflakes on the railway car at Springfield, he asked the prayers of his neighbors in those touching phrases whose echo rose that night in invocations from thousands of family altars, to the memorable hour when, on the steps of the national Capitol, he humbled himself before his Creator, in the sublime words of the Second Inaugural, there is not an expression known to have come from his lips or his pen but proves that he held himself answerable in every act of his career to a more august tribunal than any on earth. The fact that he was not a communicant of any church, and that he was singularly reserved in regard to his personal religious life, gives only the greater force to these striking proofs of his profound reverence and faith. In final substantiation of this assertion, we subjoin two papers from the hand of the President, one official and the other private, which bear within themselves the imprint of a sincere devotion and a steadfast reliance upon the power and benignity of an overruling Providence. The first is an order which he issued on the 16th of November, 1862, on the observance of Sunday. The President, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, desires and enjoins the orderly observance of the Sabbath by the officers and men in the military and naval service. The importance for man and beast of prescribed weekly rest, the sacred rights of Christian soldiers and sailors, a becoming deference to the best sentiment of a Christian people, and a due regard for the divine will, demand that Sunday labor in the Army and Navy be reduced to the measure of strict necessity. The discipline and character of the national forces should not suffer, nor the cause they defend be imperiled, by the profanation of the day or name of the Most High. At this time of public distress, adopting the words of Washington in 1776, men may find enough to do in the service of God and their country without abandoning themselves to vice and immorality. The first general order issued by the Father of his country after the Declaration of Independence indicates the spirit in which our institutions were founded and should ever be defended. The General hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country. But if it may be said that this order was, after all, an exoteric utterance springing from those relations of religion and good government which the wisest rulers have always recognized in their intercourse with the people, we will give one other document, of which nothing of the sort can be said. It is a paper which Mr. Lincoln wrote in September, 1862, while his mind was burdened with the weightiest question of his life, the weightiest with which this country has had to grapple. Wearied with all the considerations of law and of expediency with which he had been struggling for 2 years, he retired within himself, and tried to bring some order into his thoughts by rising above the wrangling of men and of parties, and pondering the relations of human government to the divine. In this frame of mind, absolutely detached from any earthly considerations, he wrote this meditation. It has never been published. It was not written to be seen of men. It was penned in the awful sincerity of a perfectly honest soul trying to bring itself into closer communion with its Maker. The will of God prevails. In great contests each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect His purpose. I am almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By His mere great power on the minds of the now contestants, He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began, and having begun, He could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 16, Military Governors. By the Union victories in the spring of 1862, very considerable areas of territory in states in rebellion came under the control and occupation of the Union armies, namely, in Tennessee after the battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, in Arkansas after the Battle of Pea Ridge, in North Carolina after the capture of Roanoke Island, and in Louisiana after the capture of New Orleans. The sudden change from Confederate to Federal authority involved everywhere either a serious derangement or total cessation of the ordinary administration of local civil law, and the displacement from the occupied territory of State governments and State officials who claimed to be exercising functions under ordinances of secession, and yielding obedience to the self-styled Confederate States. A similar displacement had occurred in Virginia and in Missouri during the year 1861, but in those states prompt remedies were available. In Virginia, by a spontaneous and overwhelming popular movement, a delegate convention was assembled, which at once abrogated the rebel and restored a federal state government, from which in due time sprang the separation of Virginia and the erection and admission of the new state of West Virginia. In Missouri there existed a lawfully chosen State Convention, a full quorum of which was called together under its own rules, and by ordinances of undoubted validity vacated the State offices held by insurgents and appointed a provisional State government loyal to the Federal Union. Neither of these courses, however, was immediately feasible in the other States we have named, and a substitute was found in the appointment of military governors to represent and exert such State and local authority as the anomalous conditions made practicable, and as the supreme military necessities might allow. The first of these appointments occurred in Tennessee. Nashville, the capital, having been evacuated about February 23, 1862, President Lincoln nominated, and the Senate confirmed Andrew Johnson, March 4, 1862, as military governor with the rank of brigadier general. In a speech made by Governor Johnson at Nashville on assuming his duties, he thus sketched what he understood to be his official functions. The State government has disappeared. The executive has abdicated. The legislature has dissolved. The judiciary is in abeyance. The archives have been desecrated, the public property stolen and destroyed, the vaults of the State Bank violated, and its treasures robbed, including the funds carefully gathered and consecrated for all time to the instruction of our children. In such a lamentable crisis, the Government of the United States could not be unmindful of its high constitutional obligation to guarantee to every State in this Union a republican form of government. This obligation the national government is now attempting to discharge. I have been appointed, in the absence of the regular and established State authorities, as military governor for the time being, to preserve the public property of the State, to give the protection of law, actively enforced, to her citizens, and as speedily as may be, to restore her government to the same condition as before the existing rebellion. I find most, if not all, of the offices, both State and Federal, vacated either by actual abandonment or by the action of the incumbents in attempting to subordinate their functions to a power in hostility to the fundamental law of the State and subversive of her national allegiance. I shall therefore, as early as practicable, designate for various positions under the State and county governments, from among my fellow citizens, persons of probity and intelligence, and bearing true allegiance to the Constitution and government of the United States, who will execute the functions of their respective offices until their places can be filled by the action of the people. Conforming to this precedent, Mr. Lincoln, through the Secretary of War, appointed Edward Stanley, military governor of North Carolina, with authority to exercise and perform within the limits of that State all and singular the powers, duties, and functions pertaining to the office of military governor, including the power to establish all necessary offices and tribunals, and suspend the writ of habeas corpus, during the pleasure of the President, or until the loyal inhabitants of that State shall organize a civil government in conformity with the Constitution of the United States. It is obvious to you, added the Secretary on the 20th, that the great purpose of your appointment is to reestablish the authority of the Federal Government in the State of North Carolina and provide the means of maintaining peace and security to the loyal inhabitants of that State until they shall be able to establish a civil government. In like manner, soon after news was received of the successes in the Gulf, Colonel G. F. Shepley of the 12th Maine Infantry of Butler's army was appointed military governor of Louisiana, this selection being made because General Butler had already designated him to act as mayor of the city of New Orleans, and it was thought best to combine both functions in the same individual. The utility of such appointments had been so far demonstrated that when General Curtis, after the Battle of Pea Ridge, had marched down White River to Helena on the Mississippi River and was preparing to resume from that point his meditated advance on Little Rock, with every prospect that he would be able to hold it permanently, a similar commission as military governor of Arkansas was given to John S. Phelps, a citizen of Missouri, with the intention that he should accompany the army and assume his duties as soon as the capital of the State was reached, to prevent the delays of communication to and from Washington. Subsequent military events, however, delayed the advance of the Union army to that place more than a year, and when it finally occurred, a spontaneous popular movement organized a convention which appointed a provisional governor, rendering the intervention of a military governor unnecessary. Mr. Phelps, therefore, never actually entered upon any practical official duties. It is not within the scope of this work to review the official administration of these military governors, except so far as it relates to the action of President Lincoln on the subject of what is known as reconstruction, or more properly the reorganization of loyal State governments. His treatment of the question, both theoretical and practical, grew logically out of the successive military and political events of his administration. In his inaugural address, the President had laid down the following propositions: I hold that, in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these States is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It follows from these views that no State, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union. That resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary, according to circumstances. I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken. And in his special message to Congress on July 4, 1861, occurs this supplementary declaration: the States have their status in the Union, and they have no other legal status. If they break from this, they can only do so against law and by revolution. It is hardly necessary to prove that by the term revolution the President meant successful and not merely attempted revolution. The action of the government in all its departments was based upon the idea that the rebellion was the unlawful proceeding of individuals which neither destroyed nor impaired any rights or obligations of statehood, nor even any rights or obligations of their co-citizens who remained loyal. This doctrine was announced by Mr. Lincoln in the same special message, where he declared, "The people of Virginia have thus allowed this giant insurrection to make its nest within her borders, and this government has no choice left but to deal with it where it finds it, and it has the less regret as the loyal citizens have in due form claimed its protection. Those loyal citizens this government is bound to recognize and protect as being Virginia." The language refers, of course, to the provisional government headed by Pierpont, which was organized by the Wheeling Convention. Congress took precisely the same view of the matter in recognizing and admitting to seats not alone senators and representatives from Virginia and Missouri, where provisional loyal State governments had been organized, but also Senator Andrew Johnson and Representatives Horace Maynard and Andrew J. Clements from Tennessee, where no such reorganization had taken place. We have no further expression of Lincoln's views until the midsummer of 1862, when he touched upon the subject quite incidentally in connection with Louisiana matters. Reverdy Johnson, who had been sent there on government business, wrote him that complaints were being made about the course of General Phelps of Butler's army. In his reply of July 26, 1862, Mr. Lincoln wrote: "The people of Louisiana, all intelligent people everywhere, know full well that I never had a wish to touch the foundations of their society or any right of theirs. With perfect knowledge of this, they forced a necessity upon me to send armies among them, and it is their own fault, not mine, that they are annoyed by the presence of General Phelps. They very well know the way to avert all this is simply to take their place in the Union upon the old terms." 2 days later, the President developed his idea more fully in a letter to Cuthbert Bullitt. "The people of Louisiana who wish protection to person and property have but to reach forth their hands and take it. Let them in good faith reinaugurate the national authority and set up a State government conforming thereto under the Constitution. They know how to do it, and can have the protection of the Army while doing it. The Army will be withdrawn so soon as such State government can dispense with its presence, and the people of the State can then, upon the old constitutional terms, govern themselves to their own liking." It would seem that after writing this letter, President Lincoln took no further action upon the subject of reconstruction for more than 2 months. During this time he fully matured the policy he intended to pursue in regard to slavery, and definitely announced it in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862. That proclamation gave notice that States which were in good faith represented in Congress would be deemed not in rebellion, and would by such return to loyalty escape the threatened penalty of emancipation. In addition, it seemed to him but just to give, so far as he could, a reasonable opportunity for such repentance to manifest itself. Accordingly, on the 14th of October, he sent, by a former resident of Louisiana and the only representative from that State who had kept his seat in Congress in defiance of her ordinance of secession, the following confidential letter to the commander of the Department of the Gulf and the military governor of Louisiana. Executive Mansion, Washington, October 14, 1862. Major General Butler, Governor Shepley, and all having military and naval authority under the United States within the State of Louisiana. The bearer of this, Honorable John E. Bouligny, a citizen of Louisiana, goes to that State seeking to have such of the people thereof as desire to avoid the unsatisfactory prospect before them, and to have peace again upon the old terms under the Constitution of the United States, to manifest such desire by elections of members to the Congress of the United States particularly, and perhaps a legislature, State officers, and United States senators friendly to their object. I shall be glad for you and each of you to aid him and all others acting for this object as much as possible. In all available ways give the people a chance to express their wishes at these elections. Follow forms of law as far as convenient, but at all events get the expression of the largest number of the people possible. All see how such action will connect with and affect the proclamation of September 22. Of course, the men elected should be gentlemen of character, willing to swear support to the Constitution as of old, and known to be above reasonable suspicion of duplicity. Yours very respectfully, A. Lincoln. There appears to have been some delay in the delivery of the foregoing letter to Governor Shepley, though it would seem that the President's desire to have members of Congress elected became known to the New Orleans politicians, who naturally were interested in these prospective chances, and one of them came to consult the President. He bore back with him a letter explaining that Mr. Lincoln desired a genuine election and not a sham, a revival of healthy political action to demonstrate whether or not Louisiana contained any loyal citizens. Dear Sir, Dr. Kennedy, bearer of this, has some apprehension that Federal officers, not citizens of Louisiana, may be set up as candidates for Congress in that State. In my view, there could be no possible object in such an election. We do not particularly need members of Congress from there to enable us to get along with legislation here. What we do want is the conclusive evidence that respectable citizens of Louisiana are willing to be members of Congress and to swear support to the Constitution, and that other respectable citizens there are willing to vote for them and send them. To send a parcel of Northern men here as representatives, elected, as would be understood, and perhaps really so, at the point of the bayonet, would be disgraceful and outrageous. And were I a member of Congress here, I would vote against admitting any such man to a seat. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. Hon. G.F. Shepley. On the same day, the President also addressed a private letter to Governor Shepley, setting forth at considerable length the specific action he wished the military governor to take to inaugurate reconstruction. Your letter of the 6th instant to the Secretary of War has been placed in my hands, and I am annoyed to learn from it that, at its date, nothing had been done about Congressional elections. On the 14th of October, I addressed a letter to General Butler, yourself, and others upon this very subject, sending it by Honorable Mr. Bouligny. I now regret the necessity of inferring that you had not seen this letter up to the 6th instant. I enclose you a copy of it, and also a copy of another addressed to yourself this morning upon the same general subject, and placed in the hands of Dr. Kennedy. I ask attention to both. I wish elections for congressmen to take place in Louisiana, but I wish it to be a movement of the people of the district, and not a movement of our military and quasi-military authorities there. I merely wish our authorities to give the people a chance, to protect them against secession interference. Of course, the election cannot be according to strict law. By state law there is, I suppose, no election day before January, and the regular election officers will not act in many cases, if in any. These knots must be cut, the main object being to get an expression of the people. If they would fix a day and a way for themselves, all the better. But if they stand idle, not seeming to know what to do you fix these things for them by proclamation, and do not waste a day about it, but fix the election day early enough that we can hear the result here by the 1st of January. Fix a day for an election in all the districts, and have it held in as many places as you can. Under this direction of the President, Governor Shepley caused an election for members of Congress to be held in the 1st and 2nd congressional districts of Louisiana, each of which embraced about one half of the city of New Orleans, with some outlying territory, all other districts of the state being outside the Union military lines. The usual legal forms prescribed by the statutes of the state were observed. The governor appointed sheriffs and commissioners of election, and old citizens of the state of loyalty and respectability accepted the appointments and discharged their duties to the entire satisfaction of both candidates and voters. The election was held on the 3rd of December, 1862, in perfect order and quiet. It was in no wise interfered with by the army, and no federal office holder was a candidate. Indeed, it was admitted that for the first time in a considerable number of years every qualified voter might freely cast his ballot without fear of intimidation or violence. In the first district, B.F. Flanders was chosen by 2,370 out of the total of 2,643 votes. In the second district, Michael Hahn was chosen by 2,799 out of the total of 5,117, about one-half the usual vote having been polled in each district. Flanders and Hahn were admitted to seats in the House of Representatives after full scrutiny, the chairman of the Committee on Elections declaring that this had every essential of a regular election in a time of most profound peace, with the exception of the fact that the proclamation was issued by the military instead of the civil governor of Louisiana. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 17, Colonization. The political creed of Abraham Lincoln embraced, among other tenets, a belief in the value and promise of colonization as one means of solving the great race problem involved in the existence of slavery in the United States. This belief he had learned from the teachings of some of the most eminent American statesmen, notably from the leader and idol of the Whig party, Henry Clay. It was a theory which commended itself especially to progressive thinkers in the Southern States, as a doctrine permitting them the expression of liberal and humane views on slavery, without subjecting them to the odium connecting itself with the avowal of what was stigmatized as simple abolitionism. We need not here discuss the doctrine of colonization. It had been advocated for half a century, favored by some of the greatest minds of the nation, and the government was fully committed to it by the part it had practically and officially taken in the establishment of first the colony and afterwards the independent state of Liberia. When we consider all the conditions under which that experiment was tried, it is perhaps equally rash to pronounce it either a success or a failure. Without being an enthusiast, Lincoln was a firm believer in colonization. He did not shut his eyes to its difficulties. "If all earthly power were given me," said he in debate with Douglas, "I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that, whatever of high hope as I think there may be in this, in the long run its sudden execution is impossible. If they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days, and there are not surplus shipping and surplus money enough in the world to carry them there in many times 10 days." But he had also said a year before, "The enterprise is a difficult one, but where there is a will, there is a way, and what colonization needs most is a hearty will. Will springs from the two elements of moral sense and self-interest. Let us be brought to believe it is morally right, and at the same time favorable to, or at least not against our interest, to transfer the African to his native clime, and we shall find a way to do it, however great the task may be." When Lincoln uttered these sentiments, he little dreamed that the problem would ever confront him in a serious practical form. But already, during the first year of the war, large numbers of slaves in rebel states not only became actually free by escape or capture, but also legally free through the operation of the earliest Confiscation Act, approved August 6, 1861. In this new condition their protection and maintenance to a considerable extent fell upon the government, and while the able-bodied rendered service in return, the care and support of those incapable of military labor formed a serious burden upon Army resources and supervision. In touching on the question in his first annual message to Congress, the President took into view the future of slaves freed and to be freed by Army movements. He had already resolved upon his plan of compensated abolishment, through which he hoped to bring about emancipation in the border States, and it seemed to him that nothing would contribute so powerfully to this result as some comprehensive and well-considered scheme of colonization. He therefore strongly urged the project in his message, recommending the appropriation of money and the acquisition of territory for that object, keeping always in view, however, as specifically declared in his later messages, that it should be with the consent of the freed people. Congress responded to these recommendations by 3 distinct enactments. First, the appropriation of $100,000 to aid in the colonization and settlement of such free negroes residing in the District of Columbia, or of those to be freed under the Emancipation Act for that district, as may desire to emigrate to the Republic of Hayti or Liberia, or such other country beyond the limits of the United States as the President may determine. Second, an appropriation of $500,000 to carry out the act of Congress for the emancipation of the slaves in the District of Columbia, and to colonize those to be made free by the probable passage of a confiscation bill. Third, a clause of the Confiscation Act that the President of the United States is hereby authorized to make provision for the transportation, colonization, and settlement in some tropical country beyond the limits of the United States of such persons of the African race made free by the provisions of this act as may be willing to emigrate, having first obtained the consent of the government of said country to their protection and settlement within the same, with all the rights and privileges of free men. In accordance with the authority conferred by these acts, Mr. Seward, on the 30th of September, addressed a circular to the governments of England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark, making known to them the desire of the President to enter into negotiations on the subject of colonization with any foreign power having territory or colonies within the tropics, which, maintaining free constitutional government, might desire the benefits of such emigration. He suggested a 10 years treaty, mentioning also somewhat elaborate specifications of guarantees for the perpetual freedom, protection, and equal rights of the colonists and their descendants. Both before and after the transmission of this circular, various propositions came to the Department of State offering lands for such colonization in the Danish island of St. Croix, West Indies, in the Netherland colony of Suriname, in the British colony of Guiana, in British Honduras, in Haiti, in Liberia, in New Granada, and in Ecuador. Among these propositions, two only commended themselves to the special attention of the President. The first was a colony proposed to be settled on the lands lying on the lagoon and harbor of Chiriqui in the northwestern corner of the State of Panama, of the Republic of New Granada, along the line of one of the proposed ship canals across the Isthmus of Darien. It was reported that here, in addition to the ordinary advantages of tropical soil and climate, and its proximity to a prospective route of international commerce, there existed valuable deposits of coal, the mining of which for naval supply would at once furnish profitable occupation to labor. This locality seemed to offer such a combination of favorable opportunities that Mr. Lincoln for a time interested himself greatly in the examination and furtherance of the enterprise, and a preliminary contract was made with the grantee of the lands to begin colonization and improvements as soon as an eligible site could be selected. Two obstacles to the consummation of the scheme, however, developed themselves. One was that a conflict of title and jurisdiction between the States of Costa Rica and New Granada was brought to the notice of the Department of State, which caused a suspension of preparations until it could be settled. The other was of a yet more serious character. Documents and reports which had been submitted to the President seemed sufficiently to authenticate the existence of valuable coal beds at the point indicated, but feeling a necessity for the greatest caution in an undertaking of such magnitude and consequence, he referred the question to Professor Henry of the Smithsonian Institution for scientific examination. This discreet and learned officer answered that the geological formation of the Chiriqui district is not that of the true coal measures, but that of the tertiary deposit in which only lignite is found. He further enclosed the written opinion of an expert, which pronounced the Chiriqui coal of little or no commercial value. A boxful of it sent to the Academy of Sciences, Philadelphia, has slacked down to a boxful of coal dirt. This is, of course, owing to the abundance of sulphuret of iron. It would be a dangerous coal also to carry on voyages, for it would spontaneously take fire. I think that if the government owned large beds and extensive tracts favorably situated for getting out the coal, it would not use the coal when placed in depot, and would abandon the mines after they had been opened. Professor Henry therefore added this emphatic advice: I hope the government will not make any contracts in regard to the purchase of the Chiriqui district until it has been thoroughly examined by persons of known capacity and integrity. A critical examination of all that has been reported on the existence of valuable beds of coal in that region has failed to convince me of the fact. This revelation, added to the controversy about the title, seems to have terminated the Chiriqui enterprise. Before this result was reached, another project had been under consideration to establish a colony on one of the islands of Haiti. A Mr. Bernard Koch, represented to be a businessman, thus described the locality in a letter to the President: The most beautiful, healthy, and fertile of all the islands belonging to the Republic of Haiti is the island of Avache, which is about 12 miles from the city of Auquays. It covers an area of about 100 square miles, is known to be free from reptiles, and to have a healthy and agreeable temperature, the thermometer rising rarely above 80 degrees in the shade, in consequence of its exposure to the trade winds. The interior of the island is hilly, in some places rising as high as 300 feet above the level of the sea. It is well timbered with mahogany, oak, hard and dye woods, while in the neighborhood of the coast it is mostly prairie land and ready for the plow. As would be expected in a country like this, the soil and climate are adapted for all tropical productions, particularly sugar, coffee, indigo, and more especially cotton, which is indigenous. Upon the north side of the island is the beautiful Bay of Ferret, with an average depth of 28 feet, upon whose bosom a large fleet could repose in safety, secure from the storms of the ocean. And here it is proposed to erect a commercial city, with all the conveniences necessary to such an enterprise. Before the revolution which gave St. Domingo to the colored race, a portion of this island was cultivated by the Duke of Praslin, to whom it belonged by right of concession, but the French were driven from it, and for nearly 100 years it has been a solitary waste, awaiting the hand of industry to awaken its echoes. Attracted by its beauty, the value of its timber, its extreme fertility, and its adaptation for the cultivation of cotton, I prevailed upon President Geffrard to concede the island to me for 20 years, the documentary evidence of which has been lodged with the Secretary of the Interior. On the 31st of December, 1862, the President signed a contract under which Bernard Koch, for a compensation of $50 per head from the government, agreed to colonize 5,000 persons of African descent on the island of Avache. The contractor bound himself to furnish the colonists comfortable houses, garden lots, substantial food, medical attendance, and medicines, provide them churches, religious instruction, and elementary schools, and employ them during 4 years for money wages at rates varying from $4 per month for minors and women to $10 per month for male adults. 10 hours' work to constitute a day's labor. The contractor further agreed to procure from the Haytian government the guarantee stipulated for in Mr. Seward's circular of September 30, 1862, proposing emigration to foreign governments as follows: all such emigrants and their posterity shall forever remain free, and in no case be reduced to bondage, slavery, or involuntary servitude, except for crime; and they shall specially enjoy liberty of conscience and the right to acquire, hold, and transmit property, and all other privileges of persons common to the inhabitants of the country in which they reside. It should be further stipulated that in cases of indigence resulting from injury, sickness, or age, any of such immigrants who shall become paupers shall not thereupon be suffered to perish or come to want, but shall be supported and cared for as is customary with similar inhabitants of the country in which they shall be residents. Koch thereupon sought the financial assistance of certain capitalists in New York and Boston, and laid before them this brilliant scheme of speculation. He would transport 500 emigrants to this island. They would immediately begin a plantation on which, by the 1st of the following September, a period of 8 or 9 months, he would guarantee a crop of 1,000 bales of cotton, which cotton, at the prospective war price of $1 per pound and 450 pounds to the bale, would yield nearly $500,000. The estimate of necessary outlay to accomplish this result he placed at $70,000. The hearts of millionaires could not withstand the temptation of a project which promised a profit of more than 600% in 9 months, especially as it combined itself with the opportunity of promoting great moral benefits to country and humanity. Without taking the necessary time and pains to investigate rigidly the personal character and qualifications of Bernard Koch, or even to inspect the contract which the President had signed, but depending blindly upon the misrepresentations Koch made to them, they became responsible for considerable advances and expenditures with which he began to freight ships and collect emigrants. But a brief time had elapsed when it became known to the government that Bernard Koch was an irresponsible and untruthful adventurer, whose project had no substantial foundation except his lease of the island and the confidence the capitalists had given him. There was also an ominous rumor that he was in league with Captain Semmes, the Confederate privateer, to hand over the negroes to him on the high seas as captured runaway slaves. Under such circumstances, the President not only refused to proceed, but immediately caused the contract to be canceled. This turn of affairs left the capitalists in an awkward situation, and to secure their financial venture on the one hand and the continuance of the experiment of colonization on the other, they caused Bernard Kock to assign his lease of the island to them, and they in their own names entered into a contract with the Secretary of the Interior on the 6th of April, 1863, similar in its main features to the one which had been cancelled. Under this second contract, a shipload of colonists was collected from among the contrabands about Fort Monroe, and during that month the Ocean Ranger sailed for Isle aux Vaches with colored emigrants, variously stated to number from 411 to 453 persons, about one-third of whom were women and children. In the absence of full records, there is uncertainty, not alone about the number of persons, the date of sailing, and date of arrival, but also about the correctness of charges of neglect and privation during the voyage. One sad occurrence is admitted by all. Through some carelessness, infection from a military hospital on Craney Island was carried on shipboard, and during the voyage smallpox broke out, from which 20 or 30 died. The scourge was soon controlled after landing, but other hardships confronted the colonists. No hospital was ready for the sick, no houses were ready for those who were well. The small stock of lumber sent out was used for the main buildings and warehouses, and the working people were obliged to shelter themselves in huts of wicker work and palm leaf thatch, rudely constructed after the Haytian fashion. Exposure, which ought to have been provided against, brought a certain amount of sickness which might have been avoided. The delays attending the sailing brought the colony to its destination in an unpropitious season. Bernard Kock was sent along as governor of the colony because of the legal formalities necessary to the assignment of his lease; but although he was merely a political and financial dummy, he put on the airs of a petty despot, and by neglect and oppression rendered himself so obnoxious to the colonists that they finally drove him from the island. Some of the white superintendents sickened and died. Insect pests tormented the badly sheltered people. Between accusations of mismanagement and oppression on the one side, and of idleness, extravagant demands, and mutiny on the other, the quiet and security of the settlement were far from Arcadian. Churches and schools remained only dreams of a forgotten promise. The Haytian government naturalized the emigrants, but refused to give the guarantee stipulated for by Mr. Seward. It is alleged that parties on the mainland, interested in rival projects of colonization, busied themselves in stirring up discontent to thwart the enterprise. The 1st of September came, but there were no crops for food, no 1,000 bales of cotton, only a wharf and a number of buildings on a fine bay and harbor, flanked by a motley and miserable collection of huts, and some roads cut through the almost impenetrable jungle from the extemporized village to the more eligible savannas or prairies lying a mile or two inland. Rumors of the situation had come to the President, and on the 17th of October D.C. Donahue, a special agent, was instructed to go to the colony to investigate its condition and afford it relief. Numerous unavoidable causes delayed his arrival until the 15th of December. On the 12th of December, the silent partner in the firm of capitalists whose names were signed to the contract wrote to the Secretary of the Interior, saying, "By the next steamer I shall send out instructions to supply them, the emigrants, with nothing more at our expense, nor shall we pay any further drafts that may be made for their support." The report of the special agent says, "Upon my arrival at the island, I was informed that the company, the contractors with the government, had ceased to give the emigrants either employment or wages since the 5th day of November, 40 days before my arrival. I found that there was but a small stock of provisions upon the island, and but a small portion of these suitable for the sick. Another part of his report states, I found there surviving of that party, a few of the number at O'Kays, 378 souls. The residue of the 431 mentioned in the journal of one Bernard Koch, who accompanied the emigrants, had either died or returned to the United States. My information is that the number of the latter was 8. Of the number on the island, 31 were seriously sick, and numerous others more or less disabled from the effects of poisonous insects in their feet. 4 died before leaving the island. According to the instructions he had received, the special agent immediately assumed charge of the emigrants, furnishing them with the necessaries of life, and ameliorating their condition in every feasible way. He found upon inquiry that the Haytian government was unwilling that the emigrants should remain upon the island, and they, on the other hand, were thoroughly dissatisfied and of one desire, to return to the United States. As soon, therefore, as the necessary arrangements could be made, the Secretary of the Interior sent a vessel to bring them back, and on the 4th of March, 1864, the survivors sailed from the island on the ship Marshalsea Day, casting anchor in the Potomac River opposite Alexandria, Virginia, on the 20th of the same month. The statements of both sides are so conflicting that it is impossible to form a satisfactory judgment whether, under better management, this experiment of colonization would have succeeded. The company alleged that their agents and superintendents, by actual trial, demonstrated the essential unfruitfulness of the soil. The government's special agent declared that the island of Vache is inconceivably fertile and as well watered as could be desired, very healthy considering the latitude, and well calculated to support the emigrants and yield a large surplus of the most valuable products. During my stay on the island, the colonists, under my direction, neatly dressed a field of about 20 acres of cotton, then just springing from the ground, and I had the pleasure, before my departure, of seeing this cotton beginning to ripen, having obtained a growth far beyond any I had ever seen, though I have visited and been acquainted with the best cotton-growing regions of the United States. To this statement he, however, adds the further opinion, for the formation of which his observations and experience would seem to have furnished him good opportunities. There are, in my judgment, reasons which will, for many years to come, render abortive all attempts at colonizing the free colored people of the United States in the Republic of Hayti, prominent among which are the great dissimilarities which exist in language, religion, education, and government. But aside from theories that might be faulty, or reports of observation which might prove inaccurate, the events of the war had already moved the question forward beyond the stage of judicious experiment. No further effort at colonization was made by the President, and by an act approved July 2, 1864, Congress repealed its appropriations for that object. End of chapter 17.